it's
Okay.
setting up.
Yep. Send me the new link onto the in the Zoom chat.
Okay, yeah, we're live now. Yeah.
Could you send me the new link though? I'll post it in the channel.
Yeah, I've sent it in the chat.
All right.
Yeah, I've sent it.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna tell them to shift over.
Yeah, we're live.
Could you send me the new link?
Yeah, I've sent it in the chat. Yeah, I've sent it.
All right, cheers. Thanks, mate. Okay, bye. Okay. There was more than just a hiccup, I'm sorry. You're live now, right?
Yes.
Okay. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use your new link that works. I'm going to paste it into this current link here. And in this current page, and then hopefully people who go to this page will be redirected to the link that actually works.
Yeah, okay,
All right.
thank you.
Okay. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use your new link that works. I'm going to paste it into this current link here. And in this current page, and hopefully people will go to this page will be redirected to the link that actually works.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay.
Can I start sharing the screen now and start the event, or should we wait for a few minutes?
Just let me do some final checks. Just give me 2 minutes.
No, it's fine.
Yep, you can start now.
Thank you. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Perfect, let's get started then.
Amazing. Right. So, hi everyone. Apologies for the wait. We have had a few technical issues, but it's all sorted now. So thanks so much for tuning in today for our panel discussion, cybersecurity, politics, and the internet. So first, I'm going to quickly introduce our society. So we are WIPA, which stands for Women in Politics and International Relations. We're a brand new society at the University of Edinburgh that's seeking to establish a community for all genders with the main goal of empowering women in politics and IR fields. We want to open up the conversation about the participation of women in these fields and give visibility to so many amazing women who have been omitted for so long. So just quickly run down who our committee are. So we're made up of 5 members from different PIR career paths and in different academic years. We've got Andrea, who is our president, Anna as our treasurer, Evelyn as our secretary, Natalie as our director of marketing, and myself as our director of sponsorship. So just quickly say a huge thanks today for our hosts, the Future Conference, for innovatively providing this platform to students who have all been impacted by the pandemic and giving them a valuable insight from industry professionals through panels like we have today, workshops and interactive sessions, which will no doubt inspire and foster a continuous community full of diverse ideas and borderless potential. So without further ado, I'll quickly run down today's agenda. So following on from my introduction, Evelyn will introduce our fantastic panelists. Then Natalie will begin the dialogue and discussion, which we aim to last around 50 minutes. Then Andrea will do a 20-minute Q&A, and then we will finish up at around 5:20 to do our concluding remarks and thank yous. So thank you for listening, and now I will pass you over to Evelyn.
I'm very happy to present our amazing panelists for today's session. We've got 4 wonderful speakers from various disciplines, ranging from politics to philosophy and economics, that will provide different perspectives on the questions at hand around politics and the internet. So first, I'd like to introduce Professor Natalie Chowdhury. She's Professor of Political Science at MIT, is a senior faculty at the Center of International Studies and faculty affiliate at the Institute for Data Science and Society. Professor Chukri directs the research initiatives of Cyber IR at MIT and serves as principal investigator at the MIT Harvard project on explorations in cyber international relations. She's the architect and director of the Global Systems for Sustainable Development, and her advisory activities include 2 terms as president of the Science Advisory Committee of UNESCO's Management of Social Transportation Programme. I'm also very happy to introduce Dr. Josephine Wolf. She's Assistant Professor of Cybersecurity Policy at the Fletcher School of Tufts University. Her book, You'll See This Message When It's Too Late, The Legal and Economic Aftermath of Cybersecurity Breaches, was published by MIT Press in 2018. Prior to joining Fletcher, she was an assistant professor of public policy at the Rochester Institute of Technology and a fellow at the New America's Cybersecurity Initiative and Harvard's Bergham Claims Center for Internet and Society. I'm also delighted to introduce Dr. Galit Wellner. She's assistant professor, researcher and lecturer in philosophy of technology, and currently works at Tel Aviv University and the MB School of Design. Galit studies digital technologies with the tools of philosophy and technology, especially post-phenomenology. And after years of working at the Israeli high-tech industry, she returned to academia to better understand technologies. Today, her research moves in 2 directions: the mapping of gender bias in IA technologies and a formalization of the internationalities involved in the development of usage of AI. And last, but definitely not least, I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Leonie Tatzler. She's lecturer in international security and emerging technologies at UCL and has a research interest on the intersection of technology, security, and gender. She was postdoctoral research associate for the EPRSRC funded Petra Internet of Things research hub, where she was part of the standards, governance, and policy research team. And her current focus is mainly on technology and domestic abuse issues. So now that I've introduced our panelists, our very impressive guest speakers, we can move into the discussion. Natalie.
Hi guys, I'm Natalie, Director of Marketing, and I will be chairing the panel discussion. So just to reiterate what the rest of the committee have said, we're really grateful to have such amazing and insightful people here to talk to us about some of the discussion topics regarding cybersecurity. I will request that each speaker limits their response to each question to about 3 minutes per person, as we have quite a few questions we want to get through, and then open it up to the audience for some Q&A. So to start the discussion, the first question I will be posing is, should the internet be nationalized? I think it's a very topical question and seems to be what everyone is getting asked these days. So I will begin the discussion by opening the floor to Ms. Gallet.
Thank you very much. I think that the internet is already nationalized. It's not a question of if or when, it's already happening. First, that we see that certain countries just block the internet when they have some affairs. And I would like to remind them it's not kind of the regimes that we would like to follow. But on the other hand, there is a positive side of this nationalization. I was part of UNESCO's IFAP, which has to do with the internet policies. And there I've seen the efforts of many countries to preserve their languages through the internet. We saw that a lot with Russia. The Russian delegates in IFAP were very active in this sense. But but I still remember that for Hebrew language, for example, it took us a long time until we got an internet that goes in the wrong direction. And we were lucky to have other languages like Arabic that had the same problem like us. So in a sense, it might be good. I wouldn't say that it's bad to have a nationalized internet. There are pros and cons, and I would like to come with something deterministic saying that it's totally wrong. Thank you.
And I will pass the mic now to Josephine.
Thank you. I think those comments are really well taken, that there's already a fair bit of nationalization on the internet around the world. I think the other thing I would say in that vein is that a nationalized internet looks very different to different countries. So China's idea of what it means to have a Chinese internet looks very different from the US idea or the European ideas about that. And part of what I think is hard here is not this question of should we nationalize the internet? Because as Dr. Wellner says, that's already happening in various ways. More the question is sort of what do we want that nationalization to look like, and how do we try to use different pressure points or incentives to get other countries on board there. And I would say there have been a lot of really interesting sort of experiments by different countries to think about this. And China has been sort of focusing on this for a long time. But more recently, we've seen other countries think about ways that they can try to impose their own laws. So Germany passed an online hate speech law a few years ago, and they've been very focused on trying to understand how can they make sure that all of their hate speech laws are being implemented online. The United States is thinking about sort of a lot of ways in which they might like to make sure that some of their laws are being enforced online. And on the whole, I think that's probably both a good thing for countries to be able to enforce their laws online and an inevitable thing. And in that sense, I'm not sure it matters very much whether or not I think it should happen. At the same time, I would say there's some sort of underlying infrastructure of the internet that hasn't really been nationalized. When we talk about things like the domain name system, the address book that's used to navigate the internet, when we think about sort of the resource allocation for the IP addresses and the names and numbers resources, that is still being operated fairly internationally. And from my perspective, that's an important piece to sort of keep operated outside the domain of any one country. And so for me, one of the interesting questions looking ahead is how long that will be able to be preserved.
Thank you for that. And I will pass the microphone now to Leonie.
Thank you so much. I can echo everything that Josephine says. I think it's really important to talk not about the internet. I mean, there's definitely different experiences that people have on the internet as an infrastructure. And I think we also need to recall that the internet is, built up of different layers. So you have the hardware layer, the cables, the undersea cables that are there, right? And how would you nationalize this? Of course, there's different providers that provide offering this, but then they are, so distributed, you could say, I want to be switched off from that for a while, but why would you do this? And then we have the IP layer that Josephine referred to, where there is actually one of the most interesting developments happening here. China has proposed a new IP system. And that is a real diversion from what we've seen in the last 60 years, if you think about it, in the 1950s as we started off, where we now have standard protocols and agreed standards of how we connect to the internet, where one country wants to go into a different route. And I think that is actually at the forefront of talking about the nationalization, where one country decides to go a new route of protocols that we have used for decades, where they want to say we want to shift to a new form. So there is developments of moving away, but I think the general international why the internet is working and why the internet is so amazing is because we have technical communities, policy communities, civil societies that have agreed on standards and protocols that we have used for a while. So nationalization can, if so, what Josephine is referring to, only happening at the service level of the last level. That's the the web, right? That's Facebook, and people associate Facebook or Twitter with the internet, but that's just on top of the infrastructure that is there. So I think we need to ask the question, what do you mean with nationalization? The infrastructure or the service level? So that's just my 5 cents to this.
And Dr. Nazli Chukri, if you'd like to take the floor.
Well, I'd like to follow up on that because the nationalization is a very complex word, depends which way you look at it. And I distinguish between the content, government control of content nationalization versus conduits, the stuff going through. So really the question is, does it help at all to think of an analogy? Should we think of the internet as if it were a road system? Who manages the rules of the road? Or is it a telephone system? We know it's not, etc. The issue the examples that you've all come up with are really very important example because there is a question of what should or what do governments do? So in the spirit of nationalization, I would say, I would like the governments to be a little bit more observant, even aside China that controls them, but observant of the behavior of the ISPs, so a little bit more responsible. And already governments worry about user conduct, but I don't see the governments intervening in the physicality and the transmission yet. Last point is, but I do see a contradiction here because there's a push towards developing some kind of international coherence or norms, not only on the content, which we already have more or less, but on the remainder of the system with respect to who controls what, who provides oversight on the behavior of IXPs, ISPs, and so forth. So
Thank you, and that leads into kind of my next question in terms of there's a lot of talk right now in the international community about a global governance system. We have the UN, and arguably the UN has worked in a lot of cases and has failed in some. Is there a possibility of having a global governance system for cybersecurity and for the internet? Will there be, is there hope of having one organization or one institution, one body that could do that? Is that a task too large for something like a global governance system, or is this something that that should be the direction in which the world is moving in, taking into consideration, like Josephine was saying and Leonie, that what is nationalization? What are we actually taking full control of? Is it just one aspect of the internet, or is it the domain in general? So I would like to open the floor again, starting with Galit.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure that I know the answer. I have to tell you the truth. It's not that I have a clear idea. Yes, we should go for one body that will make it a perfect world. Kind of the dreams we had after the Second World War with the First World War, with the introduction of the equivalent of the United Nations. We've learned some lessons, right? Now we need these kinds of organizations, but I think that we need them more in a sense of a web, of a complex network of correlations between these various bodies. Now there is a place for local governments, and there is a place for the international organizations, but I would see them as something that is cooperating, and such an organization would be something that would enable actions that are well coordinated in that sense, but it won't replace or make something out of the blue, something beautiful. I wish we could, but that's society. Any sociologist would say that it's just dreams. Okay, thank you.
And if I could pass the microphone now to Leonie.
Yeah, so I read your question and I was like thinking, technically we have a multi-stakeholder governance system. So there's already a technical community like ICANN, IETF, involved in like so many decisions around like the technical aspects. We also have like international fora, the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum, which is UN driven, where civil society comes together, the policy community comes together, the technical community comes together. Now, there's enough discussion showing that, is this a talking shop, or are actually, any decisions actually being made there? I don't see any benefit deriving from cybersecurity being managed by one central body, whether that's the UN, whether that's IETF only. I think it's good. The internet is a distributed system. It's a distributed packet networking system where we send different information through multiple layers. And I think the beauty of it is that it started off as like different people, different organizations having different responsibilities. And so while there certainly be ways we can improve that, and we did that recently with ICANN, which used to be under a body that was purely focused and under the rule of the US, and now being removed from that, I do think there's benefits to having different actors looking at different things and making sure that they are working together. So I think I'm not saying it works perfectly, but I do think the multi-stakeholder framework that we have so far is the best way forward, and ensures also that not one body can take over the rest of the IP network, etc. So yeah, that's my perspective on this.
And if I could invite Professor Nazli Chukri to also give her opinion.
I completely agree with what has been said about the management of the internet. I think I'm a little bit concerned about the fact that the state system is stepping in anyway. And we have this convention on cybercrime. Not that it works, not that it's a global convention, but the international bodies work only because the state system is involved and wants it to work. So I'm beginning to think that in addition to parallel to what has been said earlier by Leonia, which I completely agree with, when it comes to managing adverse behavior, crime, ransomware, things that hurt, then we might want to look at the venue of something like the Convention on Cybercrime to see what motivated that convention with the European Center. Is that portable, generalizable? Could other negative behaviors be managed by something not like that, but of that sort? I'm not sure that can be managed by the multi-stakeholder model of the internet, of the operations of the internet. That's my concern.
And finally, but not least, to Josephine.
So I think there's a lot to be said and has been said by my panelists about the values of the multi-stakeholder governance model. I would say on top of that, I would see a lot of value to a body like the UN being able to develop some norms for cyberspace around cybersecurity that at least many of the countries who are members could agree to. And there have been some efforts in that direction. There's a UN global group of experts that's been working on that for a while, and it really hasn't been very successful. And I think that sort of the problem, and it's not a surprising one, is that those countries involved don't agree on what a secure internet should look like, and don't actually sort of have a unified viewpoint or perspective on what kinds of behavior they're willing to engage in or not. So for instance, the US has been lobbying for years now to try and make a distinction between political cyber espionage and economic cyber espionage. And has not really made any progress on, say, convincing China that that's a meaningful distinction, or that it should agree to do one of those but not the other. I mean, the one thing I would point out, which is sort of interesting and sometimes to me at least a little bit concerning, is that because those efforts to develop international norms for cyberspace have been so unsuccessful thus far, we're now seeing different entities come in and try to lead them. We're seeing Microsoft talking about trying to develop a Geneva Convention for the internet. We're seeing sort of these private actors who we would not usually imagine in the role of developing those agreements and those norms stepping in, I think with good intentions, sort of seeing a real void here. But for me, it's a little bit, it's worth paying attention to, at least. It's a little bit alarming that all of a sudden you have a big tech company at the center of those international negotiations, whereas I might be more comfortable with that landing more squarely in the international organizations that have played that role in other domains.
And that kind of also draws into my next question, which focuses on, so we're trying to obviously establish, even with a multi-stakeholder government, a secure internet. And there's been a lot of talk about human rights and how human rights should be put into, applied to the internet still, no matter what. What does a secure internet look like in a, as Josephine, you're saying that there's private sector and public sector that are trying to control and trying to envision a safe way of using the internet, of sharing information. We can bring in political espionage, we can bring in fake news. What does a secure and safe internet look like for the future? And if I could start the discussion with Leonie.
Oh, that's such a hard question. Like, I mean, you would say you want the security for whom? Like, for example, individuals, and then you also individuals, like people are so different. I'm very concerned about like vulnerable communities like domestic abuse victims, and the needs of this kind of group is completely different than like from other actors that like have different capabilities and access as well. And then you can also say security for companies, commercial entities, which have also different needs. So I think that the real problem to minimize the risks that are out there is that we need to envision, like, threat model, basically, who would be the bad actor for, in my case, a domestic abuse victim, who would be the bad actor for a commercial actor. And commercial entities do that quite well when it comes to their threat landscape, because they're very concerned of like not having, losing financial assets, but also being liable for anything. But I think far too often, and that is based on my research, again, that looks at domestic abuse victims and the effects that emerging tech has on these communities, is that, like, if you think about like the product development, often the security issues are less so focused on what could go wrong, but more like how can we harness more data, how can we harness more economic value from that. And that would be one problem that I see, to come up with like a minimize cyber risks for all groups and communities. What we could do to hopefully mitigate that is come up with best practices, enforce aspects. I'm a big advocate for the carrot and the stick. I think there's not much carrots at the moment and not much sticks either. So I think that is something where I think we need to move into, of like, are we focusing our attention to, when it comes to cybersecurity, to all groups and communities? And to make this thing even more complicated, what we realized in our research is, even if you implement things that would help a vulnerable group in one instance, that could actually benefit perpetrators as well. Thinking here of the standard example of encryption, that helps human rights defenders as much as it helps criminals. So I think we have much more work to do to figure out like a midway. Yeah, I don't can come up with a clear answer. This would be the best state we could be in, that we're all safe, secure, happy, and privacy is guaranteed.
Thank you. And I'd like to pass the microphone to Professor Nazli.
It's very interesting, because we don't have a sense of the best state. Of course we don't. But it seems to me that we might have a sense of the lowest common denominator, something that we all agree on. We want to be at some level secure. We want the conduit to be more or less secure. You click on something, you know that where it's going, and it's going in the right place. And we're not sure this is the case now. I mean, we do the best we can. And then the issue of content. The content has two sides to it. One was already mentioned about the manufactured information, manufactured news, etc. But the other one is unauthorized intrusion in your content. And what strikes me as somewhat bothersome or problematic is how little we know about, or how few suggestions we have about how to control or stop ransomware, for example. We know the numbers, but we don't know what do we do now? So that's moving up to the area of how secure we want.
And Josephine?
This is such a hard question, and I feel like for the amount of time I've spent in my life studying cybersecurity, I should have a better vision of what a secure internet would look like. I will say when you talk to sort of strictly technical people, when you talk to software developers or engineers about security in the context of a piece of software or a computer system, the meaning of security is often that the system or the software will work in the way you expect it to, and not ways you don't expect it to. And I think that's been sort of a useful counterpoint for me to many of the ways that nations and governments try to conceive of security and what it means. And so for me, the sort of technical security of the network, exactly as Nasli was saying, is about, are you going the place that you think you're going online? Are your packets arriving where you're sending them? And I think in some ways that's the easiest part of trying to define what a secure internet would look like. And the hardest part is everything that's happening at those higher layers, at the content layers, and trying to decide what would it mean to talk about cracking down on some of the cyber crimes, ransomware, cryptocurrency theft that we're seeing now. And I think for me, and this is perhaps a little bit of a cop-out as somebody who thinks about the internet, a large part of that is about looking at regulation and policing and law enforcement in other domains, right? Thinking about the question of sort of how do we trace cryptocurrency? If there's a ransomware scheme, do we have a way of tracking who's profiting from it, rather than trying to think about how do we stop that at the technical and internet level, but how do we use some of the tools of regulation and law enforcement that we know we're good at, like tracking money flows and trying to sort of trace people that way and hold them accountable for their actions. So I think a lot of sort of my response to what would a secure internet look like comes back to the question of how do we use tools outside the scope of the internet to make sure that we're doing a better job of holding people accountable for their bad actions online, and use those norms and those tools to do a better job of making it less profitable and less beneficial to do bad things on the internet.
And last but not least, Professor Gallet.
Thank you so much. I agree with all that was said before me. I'd like to add just a small layer. And I think that there is a place for the users to take them into account and let them be heard. Today, it's so difficult for users to say, I was offended. The most they can do is go to Twitter, go to the police, and nobody can understand what they are talking about. And I'm taking this from a philosopher of technology, Andrew Feinberg, who speaks of a democratic intervention in the development processes. And I would like to expand this also to the cyber framework. I think there is a place to hear the users and find the frameworks that users can be part of the process, instead of just those that were hurt and let's leave them aside.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I completely agree. It's, in the future, if we are going to conceptualize any kind of umbrella organization or individual national organization or body that would oversee such kind of regulation, it will be extremely difficult because that space is so unregulated. And kind of drawing upon how kind of what Josephine said in terms of looking at other domains, other areas of, criminal justice, for example, can we translate that into the cyber domain, into the internet? Which kind of leads me to my final question on cyber terrorism. And there's been a lot of talk about this, especially with regards to nuclear non-proliferation. The former Secretary of Defense, William Perry, has created a whole project on enthusing people to, abolish nuclear weapons by saying, it takes just a group of really good hackers to hack the US system, find where those weapons are and detonate them. And his hypothetical scenario I found particularly chilling as someone that is hoping to go into politics and IR. So I was just wondering, I want to ask the panel, what are your thoughts on cyber terrorism, how it can be effectively tackled in the future? Is this something that, again, should be left to nations, or is this something that as a collective body we should be working towards? Is there any way of really mitigating it? So I'll open the panel with Josephine Stopp, because I know you have to leave soon.
So I would say that sort of depending on how you define cyber terrorism, and we see that term thrown around a lot, and I think that part of what makes it difficult for countries, governments, platforms to have discussions about is that, again, it often means different things to different people. But certainly it's one of the areas where I would say from the private sector side, some of the content platforms have been most willing and most eager to work with governments and work on removing extremist content online. We've seen that from Facebook, we've seen that from Twitter, a number of other platforms. So I think in that sense, it's a useful issue for some of these private and public sector entities to work on together, because there's generally pretty widespread agreement about removing content from some of these groups and making sure that the spread is pretty restricted. Whereas, say, when we look at other types of online content, there's much less agreement. There's much less kind of unanimous decision making there. I think in terms of the issue you bring up around sort of access to nuclear weapons or to other physical or kinetic forms of terrorism using cyber means, that's a really hard question for the cybersecurity people to answer. I think there's a reason that Perry's idea for how you deal with that is you get rid of nuclear weapons, because the idea that you're going to secure them perfectly in any sense from cyber attack is just kind of unthinkable. So again, I would say, you know, the terrorism that we really worry about, or the terrorism that I really worry about, is not so much something that's restricted to the internet, something that's exclusively digital, but something that makes use of those resources to target other kinds of infrastructure, whether that's nuclear weapons or the electric grid. And that, I think, really is an issue for governments to be working on in partnership with the private sector, in partnership with, you know, lots of other governments and international organizations. But that is an area where we've typically relied very heavily on state actors, and I think we'll continue to do so.
Thank you. And I'll pass the microphone to Leonie.
Yeah, I can just echo what Josephine just said. I certainly think that this is a shared responsibility, because on one side, the technical actors, the content, platforms are the ones that have the data that the police force needs to basically able to access, to see and identify who's active in the space. On the other hand, we need the law enforcement agencies and other state bodies, so to say, be able to intervene, because they are the ones that it's not just about kicking them off the platform or whatever you want to do as a technical mitigation. It's also about prosecuting them, that there's justice to be served. So I think that, so to answer your questions very quickly, it's just like, I think we need all of these actors, just as we have done in the past with conventional terrorism, however you want to say. I also want to hone in on that argument that Josephine made, that this interconnection between terrorism and cyber terrorism. I have the same problem currently with the idea of bullying and offline bullying or online bullying, as if they were different and if they wouldn't often interconnect. I'm not saying there aren't instances where it all goes through online means, but if you look at the research landscape, you see often an interconnection between offline and online space, where cyber, whatever that is even, is just another means to communicate, to conduct actions. So I think we cannot just hone in on this digital element without focusing on what happens offline and what also the physical. And I think that's also very important to me, that there's a difference between security and safety, which as a German speaker, we don't have in our language, this difference. And I think it's great that we have it in English, because safety and security means often exclude themselves. The best example I can give is open door. An open door is, from a safety perspective, perfect, because if there's fire, you can run out. From a security perspective, you want it closed because you don't want actors in. And one ways I see increasingly, especially as we move away from the internet, and again, here I'm thinking of the content sphere of Facebook, Twitter, etc., and moving more towards emerging tech, such as smart internet connected devices, where things around safety and security often are not complementing each other. And I think how we tackle this, not just when it comes to terrorism, but crime, and as I said earlier, interested in domestic violence, I think are things we haven't found standards and solutions for. So that my long-winded answer, which I could have just ended by saying we need all actors.
Thank you. No, we appreciate all the insight you are giving. And Professor Gallet?
I want to suggest another perspective on that. And I would like to draw our attention to the Darknet. And the Darknet somehow functions like a common, right? And the same way I think that we are trying to fight global warming and the change in the weather and the acidification of the oceans and all this kind of stuff, we should also we should try to implement some of the successful tactics also for the Darknet. Maybe it should be something like Antarctica, okay, and just be there. I don't know. We have to think about it, but we have to start thinking about the Darknet as something that is common to all human beings and not just to those cyber terrorists. That's for me. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, Professor Nazli.
A couple of comments, two short ones. One is safety, security. Yes, I completely agree. To this, I think we should add resilience, because resilience is an attribute of the actor or the entity or whatever. That's important. The thorny issues around cyber terrorism have to do with, of course, attribution and accountability. We know that. But more important is that we don't have a global agreement as to whether the bad guys are rogue actors or instruments of the state. And so the good guys, bad guys make it difficult to have a coherent discussion. But we would all agree that any kind of damages to nuclear weapons or nuclear capability done remotely would be a problem for everybody. So there's a foundation here for maybe some discussion, some dialogue. Here's an example. Suppose the Stuxnet saga had gone badly, and suppose something had happened and it triggered, I don't know, some kind of spillover effect into some minor nuclear or whatever. That would have been very, very serious. So a strategy to anticipate and prevent the development of nuclear capabilities could itself create unintended consequences of a very damaging nature. I'm making this up, but it's not out of the question. So pragmatically, we're dealing with something at the intersection of national security and cybersecurity, and we can't untangle them anymore because the cyber domain, the digital world, whatever, is so intimately related to everything now that we do. In the old days, meaning 5 years ago, it was possible to separate. It's not anymore. Voila.
And just kind of a final question to draw onto what Leonie and Professor Nazli were talking about. So, okay, we have this dichotomy between security and safety. In, I'd say, human rights, or when we're thinking about domestic polities, I think it's reasonable to say that safety often comes as the priority. In the cyber world, is that the case, or do we have to find a compromise? Is there a balance? I don't know, from the discussion, it sounds like maybe perhaps the 50-50 image is not as clear as we would want it to be, or maybe more. So I just want to open that to the floor. Leonie, if you would like to take that first.
I don't have a clear answer. I think the reason why I mentioned this is because, I see this. So I think we have a lot of traditional tech companies were mainly concerned with security. When I think about companies that produce products, not just software, like the Bosch, the Miele, I don't know what other international examples I can give here, but those that produced washing machines, toasters, etc., concerned with safety. And now we're moving increasingly into this world, and again, that's primarily because of my interest in research interest into this world where the software vendors become product vendors, or other way around, the product vendors have to become software vendors, because now they install more software. Not to say that previous products didn't have software, but we connected it and linked it up, which made it more vulnerable. And I think that requires both of these entities to increase their capacity in one area that might not have been their specialty before. I do think we have standards for safety and security, but again, I'm wondering how often they work together, and how often, especially like when it comes to the risks that derive from IoT, so smart internet connected device technology, from a safety perspective, they're not like directly related to safety concerns that we conventional had, like for example, a toaster burning down because it overheated, but it's actually the consequences of the usage of the technology that could have negative consequences. To give a more concrete example here, again, relating to my research, for example, the usage patterns of smart internet connected devices that give data information that could help me if I were a perpetrator to identify, okay, that person is at home, that person gets up at this time, that person likes this type of heating, the person has the door unlocked or locked. And that's then, so me being able to access that information is a security issue. And often they have already, like vendors have closed down that opportunity for me to not like see this. But with IoT, and I could go into a whole rant and lecture on this, but like often we have it open because anyone who shares a household wants to have those systems open and user friendly. But then if you don't think about like the person sitting next to you on the couch as a potential like threat actor, you will not think that they could misuse that information to then physically harm me, which make them be a safety issue. That has nothing to do where then like Microsoft or any vendor or Amazon, Google, etc. would say, well, that has nothing to do. There's nothing I can prevent from a safety or security issue to prevent that on the product level directly, which does not mean that there are not means to make it better. But I'm just saying that's their easy way to basically remove themselves from that responsibility to think about both of them. I hope that was clear. As I say, answering that in 3 minutes for something that I think deserves like a lecture or module on its own, but happy to follow up if you want more a bigger response to that.
Thank you. And Professor Nasli?
Just an extension in a way of this, but from different angles. There is some argument being made in the circles that I follow that the application providers are being now given the responsibility by default for providing security around their own applications. So if that is correct, we're expanding the role of the innovator of applications and giving them the responsibility to provide something that they were not designed to do in the first place. I tend to believe that logic because I haven't seen anything counter to it. I haven't seen even an application provider says, no, we don't care about security. We want you only to have this application, not security. So they're put in a position where they have to acknowledge that, yeah, security is important. Security of our application is important.
Thank you. And finally, Professor Gallet.
That's an amazing discussion. So interesting.
It is.
Yeah. And it led me to think about the autonomous car. And the autonomous car is just the intersection. You know, we would like to think of the internet as something that is out there, virtual, but it comes to real life with smart homes and smart cars, and the cars are getting smarter. And with autonomous cars, I think that those manufacturers, they are really struggling these days. Just between the safety and security, I really like this tension between the two notions, and I would like to think also with resiliency on that. I'm just now starting a project on resiliency and AI, so it's just in place to think about the safety and the security and the resiliency. It's such an interesting place to think about. Thank you for giving me all this food for thought.
Thank you so much to our panelists for that discussion. We're very grateful for it, and we are now going to open up the floor for some questions from the audience. I'll pass it over to Andrea.
Hi. Yeah, firstly, I just wanted to thank again all the speakers for such an enriching discussion. Unfortunately, Dr. Wolf had to leave because she had another meeting, but we would now like to open the floor for questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please send them through the chat. we're going to start with some questions we received beforehand through our social channels. And the first one would be, what do you think about big tech companies needing to take more responsibility for their actions? As in, do you think they already have enough accountability, or is there still a big gap regarding this that we need to overcome? Should I say who starts talking? Okay, so maybe Dr. Wellner, if that's okay.
I'm still thinking with Leonie with the security and safety, and that's my answer. Yeah, they should not care just about, we just discussed it. And I think Leonie has a great answer for them. Thank you.
Leonie, maybe do you want to add anything else to your previous answer? Or
as I said, I can talk about this forever. I think there's so much discussion, and I think I should say it because I bet either you've watched it or it's on your to-watch list. But there is this film called The Social Dilemma on Netflix. Not to say that I'm supporting you to purchase Netflix or whatever, and I'm like, I'm just saying there's a lot of debate, and I've watched it, and of course everyone has their opinions around it. But one thing I really liked about this film was like kind of that it showed that we've created a monster, a really big whale that we don't, or ship that we don't know how to move. And for me, this is a good example of, the carrot and the stick, that we've left the stick and the carrot for far too long. Perhaps we gave them a bit too much carrot, but the stick was far too long. And now we're looking at it, this big ship, and don't know how to disassemble it, because we realize if we tweak this, something falls out of the other. And I think that's the big problem we're facing. So the answer to your question is very simple to me. Yes, they have responsibility, but I also understand that, like, if I were a shareholder at Facebook and profit from the system that I've implemented, why would I have an interest in changing that? Why would I do that? I don't want to kill the thing that gives me money. And also, even if I were Mark Zuckerberg and I would realize this is going really nuts, something should happen. How should I do that? Because, like, if I change something, I have jobs that would fall apart. I have shareholders that would go mad at me. And also I have just the average user that might not be interested in those changes. So I think that is the big problem. And that's why I think that we can't rely on the tech to do that themselves, because simply nobody would eat their own hand, right? Why would they do that? So I think that's when when the policy or politics or regulation comes in. But then equally, I can see the dilemma of, regulators, politicians, governments saying, where should I even change this massive monster here that would make, even if I were to give that one incentive to do something different, will that really change the drastic other problems that we have with that? So I think, I guess if I were the magic decision maker today, what I would say is, I think it's about having hearings and hearing what's going wrong or being postponed to following up on certain. I would say I would put everyone in the room and say, okay, what can we technically do? And what do we from a political side want to change that it stops happening? And is that possible? That is very simplistic and it probably doesn't work either. But I think I just acknowledge the monster that is there, and simple answers such as we should nationalize, so not to say, but simple answers such as we should do something, we should nationalize, will not help, because it's like, how do you call that thing where you pull out stuff out of this block of things, or it's like a domino, you make one change and then everything collapses, and nobody wants to do that. But I think we have to eventually, if we want things to change.
Can I add something to this, please?
Yes, of course.
Just
I
quickly.
was just going to say.
I think that if we sit back and look at this whole thing, it might be useful to kind of identify what are the trade-offs, the list of trade-offs. And that won't solve the problem, but it'll give an agenda for public policy. And on the issue of responsibility, that the question that was asked, I would phrase it as accountability. They're accountable for their behavior. Sorry for the intervention.
No, please, I was just going to ask you. Yeah, thank you so much for your responses, because there is definitely a huge dilemma in there, and it's very interesting to see all of your insights. I'm just going to pass on to Natalie, because I think she has a question herself.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, I also obviously watched The Social Dilemma, because I think that was like, when it came out, I thought that, I guess this is the one thing that your parents are going to be like, watch this, watch this, watch this. And arguably I did text my mom and say, you have to get my younger sister to watch this, because she's the TikTok age and it's just like really about her. I wanted to ask, in relation to young girls and women, who it's quite evident that this is another domain in which girls and women are affected disproportionately. What is being done to combat this? I know the program obviously talks about eating disorders and self-harm, and we get all of these facts about how these things have increased, but actually mental health is still not taught in schools or required to be taught in schools. There's no such mental health awareness week or month exists, but do we do anything about it at university? Not really. So what can be done to fight this? Can the private sector get involved with this? Is this just a solely public sector issue? I wanted to get your opinion on how this affects, how and what should be done about how it affects women and young girls. And I guess, yeah, anyone that wants to start can take the floor. Yes, Professor Gallet.
I'm thinking about this as a co-shaping. That's a term that I use a lot. And it's kind of a co-shaping between the users and those platforms. And in this co-shape, once you get the co-shaping, it means that the users, they're not passive. They don't just, get the social network on their head and boom, they have nothing to do. Like, they have to be active. And to be active, this is something that I'm doing with my students. And I'm trying to teach them ways to be active when they deal with these technologies, that they should be responsive to them and should not take them as they are, as something that is great or something that is really bad, but try to take what is good for them and reject what is bad for them, and keep checking all the time what is good, what is bad, on a very tiny micro level, but keep doing these checks and balances between oneself. And I believe that at the end, that might change platforms, but that would also save the users themselves.
Can I ask? I started writing, and there's so much I want to say, and I don't think I have time to. But I think the core thing I want to ask anyone listening is, what is normal? And the reason why I'm asking that is because if you have watched The Social Dilemma, you saw the correlation between the increase of platforms and the increase of suicide and other forms of harm, like eating disorders. Now, if you ever have taken a statistic course, correlation does not mean causation. And so to this day, there's researchers that will say, it is because of social media that we have these people self-harming themselves, people have a distorted perception about certain things, but also we have certain positive things, like people being more outspoken about their mental health, people being more outspoken about body images. So we have both. And so one thing I'm asking myself increasingly is, what is normal? Because when you think about what we had before the internet, and I'm thinking here again, when I say internet, what most people associate is the web and the platforms associated with it, but technically we had the infrastructure for longer. But everything changed every time that like a technology became a general purpose technology. Television changed things, and people had all these scares of like people spending too much time in front of the television. And now we have, of course, the same argument, and that also this film addressed, like people spend too much time in front of the screen. And of course, in that film, they made a really good point between like there's technology that is waiting to be used, and then technology that has its own motivations and goals and diverts from that. And I think that was a really, really important point, because that makes for me the change to what's normal, because I do certainly think that behaviors that were previously not acceptable have become normalized. And I'm thinking here specifically, how many of you, for example, would feel comfortable checking a friend's phone if it lies on the table? How many of you will feel comfortable if you have the chance to check your partner if they texted, someone else you might not want them to? Yeah. And I ask people about this for my research. People can see it might not be okay, but it becomes normalized. And that's why we also have like a lot of other surveillance technologies entering our households, because it's okay to monitor our children nowadays for safety and security purposes. It's okay to know where my partner is when they're not with me in the house. It's okay to share passwords. And I think that has now moved away slightly from the original question of like, what can we do to do that harm? But I think the core question we have to address is, what does society consider acceptable? And I think the core problem is that technology companies have had now so long to change and modify what we thought was normal without us ever questioning, is that still okay? Because I always have this image in my mind, and in any surveillance workshop that I do is like, that frog, if you throw a frog in a hot water, allegedly they jump out. If you keep slowly increasing the water, they can deal with that heat. And that's what we had. We slowly increased what was normal and was acceptable. And that makes it now very hard for intervention, because if I were Facebook again, I would say, it wasn't me that changed that. People agreed to use that, and now to take it away, people would be like, but that was normal. It was normal to share our locations. It was normal to see when someone is typing, although we now become dependent on it. And I think we've purposefully generated a generation that thinks it's okay to have those things, and they're required and trained to do that. And I think that film showed that quite nicely and exacerbate that idea. So if this generation does not realize and recognize that something is wrong, why would it be down to the companies that profit from this to change that? Again, that comes back to my original point. And politicians, if you watch hearings, will tell you, I think this is all weird, like they can't relate to that. But then, and I'm in my 30s, so I wouldn't say I'm that old, but still, I think, like what I see with like colleagues that like are 16, I'm like, even we're like, I wouldn't be okay with that. But again, my parents were like looking at me when I was 16 and said like, that was not normal. So I think it's down to the question of what's normal, what is acceptable, and what do we feel comfortable with? And that's why they can't intervene. That was a very long answer, but sorry, and I hope it was still useful.
I will add something, not on normality, what's normal, but more about the one piece that's missing from this discussion that actually universities are beginning to address, and this is the ethics of behavior, ethics of the internet, social ethics, etc. And I think for me, my sense is that this is where the education system could have an impact. And this is where the normal question will not be addressed as what is normal, but against some kind of ethical standard that may be out of touch, maybe it's old, maybe it has to be updated because ethics are also changing. But it becomes part of the educational system that everybody goes through and is going through now. That's as far as I can take it. It's not the normal question. It's not what's normal. That I don't.
So I understand that normal is a normative question, but I also feel ethics. I mean, we hear a lot about ethical whitewashing. Why is it that like Facebook has an ethics board now? Does that change anything? No, but at least like now they don't have to regulate, because now they can say to the lawmakers and legislators, well, look, we have an ethics board. There's those fantastic people sitting on that. But I think that that's my current like dispute with ethics. It's like Google has an ethics board, Facebook, and everybody's talking about ethics in AI. But I'm also wondering, are we just like, you know, shifting away the core question? Are we still okay with this? Which I think my question around what's normal is kind of trying to.
So the question would be, what would a course about ethics in the AI age look like?
I think I have an answer. First, there is a lovely book by Mark Kuckelberg at MIT Press about the ethics of AI. But within philosophy of technology, we speak of an ethics that is not the kind of ethics that you have a code of ethics, and this is what you have to do, 5 bullets, that's it, this is what you should do, which is normally what you get from these boards. You know, you get the code of ethics and that's it. Mm-hmm. But what you need to do is exactly this co-shaping, and what kind of a subject I want to be in this world, in a world that is dramatically different, traditional philosophers, from those Greek philosophers, okay? It was different times. And they have what my supervisor, Don Ide, used to say, they have a shelf life, okay? That's it, it's finished. We have to go through a new ethics that would still take some of the key concepts, but would take them into the new context that we now have in the extensively digital world that we are facing today.
I would just like to add, put in a question there, kind of play devil's advocate almost. So just bringing it back to nuclear weapons, for example, there's this whole movement that's now trying to frame nuclear abolition in an ethical and moral standard that we must adhere by. And then the pro-nuclear movement are saying, well, you know, you're not just going to achieve abolition by some sort of norm. And kind of this makes me think of that in a sense that, are we trying to generate a norm around why why the internet is bad, and then bring it to what Leonie was saying in terms of why should the big firms have an impact? Like, why should they care? They're making money from this. What is their, like, whose role is it to kind of impel this ethics and this morality? And also, like the nuclear disarmament movement has shown, this like institutionalizing of norms is quite hard. And, you know, the US and China and Russia and the UK and France don't care about norms and international standards. So how do we shape that? How do we use, you know, the legacy, the idea of what's happening in that area of global security in terms of the internet?
I have a less dramatic example that I think can lay the foundation for your question. And this is about cigarettes. Okay, there are companies who are making huge amount of money out of cigarettes. Okay, is that good? No, they have shareholders, etc. But I don't think that they are ethical companies. And that's a clear cut, right? For all of us. We do understand that these companies are not ethical. And why they still operate beats me, I don't know. Okay, but we have certain frameworks in which it's still okay for them to operate. And they are operating. The same with the nuclear, the same with all kinds of shady internet companies. Yes, this shadiness, Shoshana Zuboff wrote a great book on this shadiness of Google and Facebook, that they are doing all kinds of shady stuff, trying to manipulate us to certain directions that we didn't want to go in the first place. Okay, so it's up to us again. We have to go on demonstrations and demonstrate online and offline, and to make these companies understand that we don't like it, okay, and that we refuse to take these as norms. No, it's not good for us, and we should have to be very careful about this. Now, if it's just you and me, well, there won't be a big impact. But the more people are saying, no, I don't want to live like this, then we might get a chance to make our imprint on this reality.
If I can go, if I play devil's advocate here, gambling and smoking are, you know, that's the example you gave. There are things I can opt into. I can choose to smoke. I can choose to gamble. Also, they are there's certain environments where we'll be exposed to them. Like if I go to a shop, then I see perhaps like the smoking sign. But whereas with tech, and again, we're talking here specifically often just around like social media platforms, I guess, you barely have a choice not to engage. I hate it when people tell me, well, you just don't need to be on Twitter and Facebook. It's like, yeah, but like, I also have a phone, and it's like, are you telling me like to not be part of society? And so I want to say that there's nearly a difference here, that becoming part of a public infrastructure, that like we just don't have a choice to not engage. And I want to come back to that point that Galit mentioned. You know, we should shift fully for it. Now, I'm a big advocate to, you know, use Tor, use encryption, use other security devices, but trust me, it's a pain in the ass. And it doesn't allow me, for example, to use certain devices then. Or also, if I use public infrastructure, such as signing up for being able to stay in the UK to join Brexit, I have to have a certain Android phone. I have to have a certain software. So even if I would have made my own setting, if I would have used Linux, or if I have used not the browser that they wanted, that wouldn't have worked. So that's, I think, the core difference here between the gambling or the smoking example to these devices, where it's like nearly, we have no choice but to use them. And that's why they should be under a far stricter regime than, like, I mean, don't get me wrong, I think gambling and smoking should be even stricter, especially seeing on, if you have watched Netflix a lot recently, these e-inhalers are everywhere on these platforms. I don't know why, they must be funded. But like, yeah, I think there's a difference. There are now the roads that Nazil has talked about.
So I have a confession to make.
Just one small comment. You can make life much easier if you fragment your identity among lots of providers. That's the key issue. Like Apple and Microsoft, and you switch between them. It's much easier than Linux, from my experience. Yeah, sorry, Natalie, please, sorry.
I just want to say very quickly, I value my time enormously. So I'm the only person I know in the world, in my world, that doesn't use Twitter. I've never been on Twitter. I don't intend to be on Twitter. Sometimes it comes to me, but at some point I better find out what it is that I'm missing. But I have to compare that with what I would lose if I were going to go to Twitter, that I wouldn't be doing if I'm not on Twitter. I don't know if the logic. So that's one part. The other part of it is that we're in the middle of a transformation. And we're trying to make sense of something that is moving very, very, very rapidly in all sorts of different directions. And like a spaghetti plate that's overboiling, and you're not sure what to do with it. And the question of normal, forced us to kind of try to force us to think about, well, what would be the system state if the spaghetti plate stopped boiling? You know, what would we have there? That's all. It's not very philosophical, but it's visually compelling, I would think.
Thank you very much. It was so great to see you all interacting with each other. So we're running out of time. So if I could just ask if any of you would like to make any final remarks, and then we'll just finish the event here. So maybe Leonie, do you want to start?
Oh, okay. I wasn't expecting to say anything. I just think, I guess what I would say, considering that this is for students, I think engage in that. That's my, don't feel like you're passive passenger on this. You can make a difference. It's not going to be easy, but I think one time we need to start to make changes to that big ship to steer it in a direction that works for us.
Thank you.
I guess I would say to students, these are very, very interesting times. In future generations, there will be textbooks written about what is happening in this era that you're living in now. And so enjoy it if at all possible. But I'd like to thank the organizers for this event, and the panelists for a great discussion. and the technicians for getting it all together. So thank you.
Yeah, we live in interesting times. I agree with you, Nazli. And I think we should remember that in the Renaissance, we always think of the Renaissance as a beautiful era, but in the Renaissance, they invented the melancholy. And let's be careful that we get the Renaissance, our own Renaissance, the digital Renaissance, without the melancholy. And I'd like to join Leonie and Nazli, and thank you, the organizers, for such a thought-provoking conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of the speakers for accepting our invitation, and to the Future Conference for having us. It was a really great event, so thank you so much. And for everyone that joined the event as well. We hope you found the discussion very interesting and thought-provoking, as Dr. Wilner just said. Yeah, thank you again to everyone. Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.